Hello, and welcome to the Conservative Christian Commentator. I'm your host, Mycroft, and I want to talk to you today about ground news. I said yesterday that I was going to make a video about this, and so here is the video. There's several primary reasons why I'm suspicious of ground news, and I think that you should be as well. Before I get into that, first off, thanks for tuning in, and second, I want to explain what ground news is, what their claims are, and then I'm going to explain what my problems with those claims are. So ground news claims on the surface to be a company that helps you discover the bias in your news sources. They claim to be a company that will categorize and rate the bias of each news source on a publication level, not an individual article level. And they claim to get their news ratings from 3 third-party organizations, which are named in some of their methodologies. And all of this sounds good on the surface. And if you pay for a ground news subscription, it will tell you the factuality of specific articles, and it will tell you the factuality of the publication in general. So on the surface, ground news seems like a very, very good thing to look at. A couple of things stand out to me, though. Just like Honey, and just like Mr. Beast, and just like so many other scandals, ground news has right now almost universal positive coverage. I like to live by a saying that Vincent Churchill once said, "Never trust a man who has no enemies." Because if you have no enemies, that means you're pleasing everyone. And you can only please everyone if you lie to a lot of people. Because if you're truthful, you can't please everyone. Just like this channel won't please everyone, and that's fine. So, just off of that makes me suspicious. If I see almost zero negative coverage for something and almost universally positive coverage for something, that makes me kind of trust it a lot less. That was part of why I was suspicious of Honey for so many years, and then, boom, this comes out. The second thing is that political bias is fundamentally unquantifiable. You cannot put political bias into an algorithm and have an algorithm that detects political bias. So that means that ground news's 3 independent companies are therefore taking and having people analyze and see which one is... see which source is factual, which source is not, which source is left, right, or center. And people have biases. People have opinions. And so anything that claims to be unbiased, that has people at its core, is lying to you. So ground news, their biggest claim to insulation from bias is that they have 3 independent companies and that they average out the scores of those companies. Well, there's no protection against, what if the companies themselves are biased? What if they're all biased in the same direction? Ground news is hoping that they're biased against each other, and they're hoping that some of them are biased against each other. So if they average out the ratings, hopefully that will help. But that makes a very big assumption that we can't make, and that is that the companies are, biased against each other. So ground news's model is very fundamentally impossible to pull off. It's impossible for them to actually do what they said they were going to do. Then in my personal experience, I've actually looked at ground news. I've considered using ground news because on the surface it sounds like such a good idea. And then I found that ground news actually does have a fairly significant left-wing bias. Now you could argue that this is due to the Overton window, but either way, this does not really help anybody. I'm going to use the issue of abortion, which is very, very distinct between the left and the right, and and what the left considers factual and what the right considers factual are 2 very different things. Now, it does not matter for the sake of this example what your stance on abortion is. I'm merely going to quantify what I have found to be left-wing views and what I have found to be right-wing views, and if you agree with them or agree with one side or disagree with one side, that's not the point, but I'm sure that everyone has highly charged opinions about this. So, on the left, it is considered factual that abortion equals healthcare, and often abortion equals vital healthcare. And on the right, it is considered factual that abortion equals murder. a lot of conservatives like me would believe that life begins at conception. When the sperm meets the egg, that's when life is created. And I happen to agree with that, but that's, again, not relevant to this example. A lot of liberals tend to believe that life either... It's rather inconsistent across the left-leaning spectrum, but a lot of people tend to, I've heard, say that life either begins when there's a heartbeat or when the infant is called, I believe it's called vitality, when the infant can survive outside of the mother's womb in case of a premature birth, and then then some people believe that life begins at birth, but none of them believe that life begins at conception. And that's necessary to believe that abortion is not murder. In fact, abortion is healthcare, and in some cases, life-saving healthcare. So, those are the left and right stances that I've seen, and as far as I can tell, they're about as close to what people believe from their perspective as I can get. So, I have looked at Ground News' coverage of issues relating to abortion, especially considering the fact that Roe v. Wade was overturned, and a lot of publications that they label centrist, and that they label stock center and often highly factual, have this very implicit assumption, and not even subtly stated in their articles, that abortion equals healthcare, which kind of betrays them as left-wing biased. This is the case on so many different issues that I could name. Immigration, and there's just so many, it's hard to start. With every single one of those issues, I have found that Ground News, with their independent political analysts, have very consistently rated left-wing, and sometimes even extreme left-wing views, as centrist and as factual. This is a problem. It would also be a problem, for the record, if Ground News was labeling right-wing views as centrist. This is not a problem that's specific to the left. This is a problem that is specific to political bias. Ground News, I believe, is a fundamentally biased organization that has the fundamentally biased independent reviewers aggregate their news. And that leads me to the fourth thing that I have a problem with Ground News, and it's the same thing that Honey had a problem with, actually. So, in order to explain this, let me explain what the problem was with Honey. The biggest problem with Honey that we found out is that they discouraged people from going out and looking for coupon codes, because they told you, we've looked out and we've gone through the entire internet, and we have found all the coupon codes for you, and it's great. Problem is, they were lying. And so they would just discourage you from going out and looking for coupon codes so people would get worse deals. So they were in fact doing the opposite of what they said. Now, Ground News discourages you from going out and trying to analyze the bias of a source. Now, it is not bad for a source to be biased. This channel is biased. Everyone is biased in their own perspective. We all can try to put away our biases to some extent, but everyone is fundamentally biased. Ground News discourages you from going out and looking for that bias so you can account for it, because they tell you they've already found all the bias. And if they're mislabeling the bias because the bias is fundamentally subjective and cannot be algorithmically quantified, and therefore you cannot remove the human bias from analyzing other humans' biases, it becomes a actual tool against information, and actually becomes a tool for, as the left likes to call it, misinformation, because it encourages people to turn their brains off and accept the rating that Ground News gives a specific publication. This is why I have a problem with them, because they discourage you from doing your own research, so to speak. And I'd like to point out that Ground News, having claimed to do all those, also they encourage people to not think about how fundamentally hard it is to rank political bias. And in my opinion, political bias is something that should be analyzed on a personal level. If you think CNN is unbiased, that's good for you. I don't think CNN is unbiased. If you think that Fox News is unbiased, good for you. I don't think Fox News is unbiased. You need to analyze the bias of every single news publication or news channel and take into account that bias when you listen to what they cover. and realize that they're coming at it from a perspective. I believe very firmly in not hiding my bias and leaving it out for the world to see, which is why I've labeled this channel the Conservative Christian Commentator. I haven't labeled it the centrist, a-religious commentator. I have labeled it the Conservative Christian Commentator because I am, as of right now, a conservative, and I'm also a Christian. I have no plans to change that, but we never know what the future will hold. So, these are my biases. Ground News is not public about their own biases, and so by pretending to rate other people's biases while not disclosing their own biases and their own areas for misinformation, they are very fundamentally a problematic service. So I will not ever be getting Ground News. I will probably never accept a sponsorship from Ground News because their business model is very fundamentally flawed from the core. You cannot quantify political bias. Each person has to be discerning about what news they accept and what facts they accept. For instance, for some of my news, I like to follow Benny Johnson. This guy has a wild conservative bias. He is extremely conservatively biased. But I know it, and he doesn't hide it. He makes no bones about the fact that he's a conservative, which makes him a much more useful news source, actually, because I know what his biases are, and I also follow other left-wing biased news sources that I have seen to be left-wing biased, and that allows me to try to see things and do essentially what Ground News is claiming to do, but for myself. Each person needs to do that for themselves, and Ground News claiming to do it for you is only causing harm to the greater public. They're only allowing people to be lured further into apathy. So, if you take anything away from this video, I would say I'm going to recommend against ever getting Ground News or paying them. Now, I've had to pay them to research this video to make sure that I'm not just spouting off the top of my head. I had to pay them to get access to their subscription services. I mean, I did the free trial, and then but I had to pay them for this video, but that's unfortunately part of the price. So I would recommend against spending your money there. Again, this is a recommendation. Take it with a grain of salt. These are my biases, but I don't think that Ground News pretending to be unbiased is a good thing. Secondly, I would recommend just branching out outside of your own political bubble and watching people you don't agree with. If you're liberal, consider watching Tucker Carlson. If you're conservative, consider watching the Young Turks. Anna Kasparian is actually doing some very good work, and she's kind of losing some liberal friends because of it. It's quite interesting to watch, and I wish her all the best. But you need to be the person who analyzes your own news. You have to think critically about the news that you consume. And you have to understand and take into account people have biases. Everyone has biases. The only people who claim to not have biases are probably the ones who are the most biased of all. So with all of that said, hope you have a blessed day, and thank you very much for tuning in.